The environmental justice movement can be traced back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and more specifically to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The movement got a boost in the 1980s in the US with evidence that low-income communities were more likely to be exposed to environmental hazards through the site selection of waste facilities and exposure to hazards in the workplace. Robert Bullard, in his book Dumping in Dixie, addressed the environmental justice movement and gave it some encouragement. Environmentalism and environmental justice are related, but they're different. Environmentalism is concerned with humanity's adverse impact on the environment, but it's primarily concerned with the impact of an unhealthy environment thrust upon collective life, human and non-human. Environmental justice is concerned with the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, incomes, and educational levels with respect to the development and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Racism and socioeconomic injustice are at the heart of environmental injustice. The movement builds on the philosophy and work of environmentalism by stressing the manner in which adversely impacting the environment in turn adversely impacts the population of that environment, how people are affected. What we find is that people of color and poor people are more likely to be impacted by environmental degradation. There are both race and socioeconomic factors. The causes of environmental racism are many. Environmental racism is the systematic exclusion of people of color from environmental decisions affecting their communities. This is a quote by Bunyan Bryant, who is someone that I actually worked for when I was at the University of Michigan as a grad student in the late 80s. Institutionalized racism deliberately and intentionally targets neighborhoods and communities of color and low incomes, and the effects of denying those citizens equal services from banks, schools, housing, and parks in the past can actually be felt today in temperature differentials in different neighborhoods with different racial populations. You'll be seeing this in the one of the articles I'm having you read for this week. Another cause of environmental racism is the commoditization of land, water, energy, and air to the benefit of those with power. Also, unresponsive and unaccountable government policies and regulations at all levels of government, from the local government up to the federal government. Lack of resources and power prevents communities from functioning as an organized bloc to represent their interests, and a piecemeal approach to regulation which allows loopholes and victimization of disadvantaged communities. What is the relationship between environmental justice and outdoor recreation? President Bill Clinton signed this Executive Order 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. This executive order was the first time that federal agencies were directed to identify patterns of natural resource use among low-income and people of color, and to develop environmental justice strategies. All of this with the goal of achieving environmental protection for all communities. early examples of environmental injustice in recreation. One of these was a study that was conducted by another one of my professors in grad school on this consumption patterns of fish caught from public waters. A study from Detroit found that Native Americans and African Americans were consuming significantly more fish caught on public lands, and those fish exceeded the standards established to protect citizens from toxins in those contaminated waters. Another study found that bottom-feeding fish, which generally retain higher levels of toxins, were more likely to be consumed by low to moderate income people of color. How does zip code relate to environmental racism? Your zip code, or where you live, determines your housing, your employment, health and access to recreation opportunities, the siting of polluting industrial facilities and major roadways impacts different zip codes in different ways. There is an inequitable distribution of parks and green spaces based on zip code. And environmental racism relegates low income and people of color to park poor neighborhoods, increasing their exposure to environmental hazards. Nature is more than an amenity. Soil, trees, and other vegetation provide important ecosystem services that actually decrease ambient heat levels in cities. Nature also acts as pollutant and carbon dioxide sinks. Nature absorbs polluted runoff, urban runoff, which helps mitigate disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards. Therefore, parks and recreation are critical to low income and people of color in urban areas for their health, safety, and well-being. And yet, they are least likely to have access to those. Parks and recreation resources must be shared among all members of society and never be limited based on race and socioeconomic status. How can we address environmental injustice? One way is to plan multi-benefit networks of urban green spaces to promote social and environmental justice in cities. This is a way to serve many people with many different kinds of opportunities for exercise, clean air, community, and fun. This is a public health issue. We can address park poverty to provide leverage for equalizing other social and environmental issues, like health and education, and giving people, local people, a say in the siting of polluting industries, and ensure that the equal distribution of these hazards across different races and socioeconomic communities, that all races are sharing these burdens. And we can protect and reclaim the commons.